and I would like to welcome you to the introductory paper seminar that PhD student Dmytro Perepolkin will have. And I can promise you, you will leave this seminar as a different person. So it's just a mild warning. And I hand it over to you, Dmytro, to introduce yourself and a bit more and the seminar.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. So first of all, hello everyone. Thank you for attending my introductory paper seminar. I am Dmytro. I am new to PhD program at Lund University. I study at the Center of Environmental and Climate Research, and we're working with Ulrika in the Uncertainty and Evidence Lab. That's a research group that focuses on understanding and studying of uncertainty. And so my introductory paper is focused around environmental models in waterfall management. And so there are several components here. First of all, the focus of my paper will be, of course, on models and what models are used in waterfall management. But I will speak about waterfall management as a decision science topic throughout my talk. And maybe we'll diverge into some other topics as well. So I want to first say a little bit about the decisions in environmental domain and how they're different from what I've learned before. I'm coming from geology and energy decision making, and compared to earth sciences, environmental decisions are also complex. They also have a lot of ambiguity. There's also a trade-off between exploitation and conservation. We want to conserve natural resources, but we also benefit from them, so we're exploiting them. That duality is inherent in basically all natural resource areas. But unlike earth science that I'm used to deal with, environmental decisions are very dynamic. They connect multiple systems together. The connections between those systems are very difficult maybe to wrap a head around. And they also deal with a lot of ethics and values and objectives, conflicts, questions, where you have ethical behavior towards animals, for example, at the forefront of the policy. And they also involve multiple agents, including farmers and animals and governments and who else. So that's a very fun domain for me to study. And I felt that I raised the bar for myself by switching to this domain of knowledge. But studying of decisions has been my passion for a number of years, and I'm privileged to be able to continue on that. So just a little bit about waterfall and how they're, let's say, classified and what is included. So it's a pretty big family of 146 species. It's a very desirable resource for hunters. There are basically, the history has been unregulated until early 20th century. So a lot of birds have been over depleted, and because of expansion of agriculture, they lost habitats and the populations have been on decline throughout the 19th century, more or less, up until half of the 20th century. And then hunting regulations and creation of refuges have turned this trend around, both first in US and then later in Europe. And today we have just a success story, basically. Waterfall management is one of the best examples of systematic and very thoughtful implementation of environmental resource management principles based on decision analysis and those things that we will be talking today. So I am sort of very proud, but also like it's a great case study to show to other disciplines within environmental management that it can be done. All right, so I'm going to diverge a little bit to talk about risk and uncertainty because it will be important to define what I mean by waterfall management under uncertainty. So Knight in 20th has proposed this classification. By risk, he means the outcome that is unknown, but the distribution from which it is sourced is known, sort of understood. It is possible to describe likelihood of every outcome. And therefore, when we are talking about uncertainty of the next random draw, then it's reasonable, or as Jane says, plausibility reasoning robots should have no hesitation to adopt that distribution for describing uncertainty in the next outcome drawn from the distribution. So this uncertainty is called aleatory uncertainty from the Latin word dice, and it cannot be reduced according to Knight. It can only be resolved. By resolved, we mean that we can wait and see what happens, and then we know. At the time of realization, we only know. There's no way of reducing that uncertainty. The uncertainty, on the other hand, the uncertainty, let's put it this way, is a situation where the source distribution from which the outcome is drawn is unknown. That lack of knowledge about the distribution is called epistemic uncertainty from the word episteme, which is referring to knowledge. And it's also expressed with probability, but that probability is describing degree of belief or plausibility, as James would put it. And the probability is, of course, personal, but it's not subjective, and that's not arbitrary in a sense. It's personal, subjective, but it's not arbitrary because it conforms to the laws of probability, axioms, and the desiderata that is stated in plausible reasoning statement. So in that sense, the uncertainty that we have about the distribution is possible to be reduced through more, let's say, data acquisition, through learning, through research. And in that sense, it is useful to know more about that uncertainty, reduce that uncertainty through experiments. So a little bit more about epistemic uncertainty, because that's the main focus of decision analysis under uncertainty. In Bayesian analysis, we're talking about learning about the source distribution from which the outcomes are drawn by samples, by observing the samples that were drawn from the distribution. We're usually inferring parameters while the likelihood is fixed, but the two are really very closely related. Parameters are only meaningful in the context of particular likelihood function. Model uncertainty sometimes can be also converted into parameter uncertainty by introducing some sort of meta parameters that are joining multiple models together. But that's not always easy to do because sometimes it's not only about choice of probability distribution or parameters within that probability distribution, but also like the functional form and alternative theory and what is generally called structural uncertainty is impossible to enumerate. We don't know all the possible choices, all the alternative theories that can exist, and therefore that structural uncertainty will be still remaining. We cannot assign probabilities because we don't have a fully exhaustive set of alternative models, but we can assign weights, and those weights can be learned and updated through experience by collecting more data. Yet another type of uncertainty is recently been introduced, is called ontological uncertainty, and that is more extreme uncertainty where our current models will be rendered obsolete in the future, and the current objectives are no longer going to be valid, and the choices will change. So that we're talking about future changes that will alter all of the variables that we have today in decision model. So you have decision model will have all of these elements set up. You have a model, you have objectives, you have alternatives. Without that, decision cannot be set up. And in the future, all these three pieces fundamental to the decision problem will be altered. Right? And that uncertainty about completely new problem that we have not yet stated. And that is what's called ontological uncertainty, and it requires non-probabilistic methods and approaches, scenario-based primarily, and this is what deep uncertainty is studying. So now I'm going to switch to decision analysis, and this is closer to home, but I want to start with epistemology first. So what's been traditional in science is the rationalism movement, or rationalist epistemology, and that can be traced back to 17th century. Cartesian, what is called Cartesian rationalism, is basically deductive reconstruction of knowledge from the single statement, I think, therefore I am. And from that statement, you basically take the world apart by questioning everything. Senses are untrustworthy. You only trust logical reasoning, and that's the only method of acquiring ultimate truth about the world. So you tear down the world to reconstruct it again through the knowledge. And the ultimate question in that epistemology is it so? And you approach to everything in science and in the world around you with that kind of testing question, is it so? In the end of 19th century, the new movement has, yet another movement has appeared in US, what is called pragmatism, primarily around Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. Pierce and Dewey has formulated that the main uncertainty is a deliberation what to do. So it's a decision-focused epistemology. So the uncertainty is not that much like we're not wondering just because, we're wondering because we want to do something about it. And therefore, our inquiry is conditioned by objectives or goals, these goals that we have, and the alternatives that we consider. So if we consider a certain number of choices, that will also define our inquiry, what we're actually learning. These very important pieces, goals and alternatives, also determine what is perceived as relevant. In particular set of choices, information may not be relevant, but if you change set of choices that you're choosing between, other information will become relevant. And that relevance question is very key to the inquiry of scientific, scientific inquiry. One of the other philosophers within pragmatism has said that our search for truth is not really reconstructing the world completely. It's more like changing one plank at a time in a ship that is in high seas. So we're replacing the pieces of knowledge that we feel are no longer serving us, or putting something else, and we're sailing along. It's never actually questioning everything. It is impossible for humans to question everything. And therefore, it's very pragmatic approach of will it work? That's the main approach. That's the main question in science. And our search for knowledge is driven by pragmatic search for usefulness. All right, so that's the main distinction. And decision analysis has originated from that pragmatic thinking, and it's based upon the, of course, philosophy of Keynes and Ramsey and Definetti and Savage. So those kind of fundamental decision theory thinkers have been at the forefront of formulating what we mean by probability and utility. Of course, it's subjectivist, so that's Bernoulli and Laplace. But also, decision analysis also incorporates Kahneman and Tversky's insight into deficiencies of human reasoning and biases that are inherent to human decision-making. And therefore, it tries to at least account, but maybe even compensate and propose something that it is prescriptive science, in the sense that it says, well, you should expect some problems to appear here. So this is an approach that might help you get around those deficiencies in human reasoning. First, decision analysis has been proposed by Ron Howard, and then supported by Howard Rafa at Harvard University. And the two of these scholars have been kind of first runners in the engineering approach to decision structuring. So a little bit about decision process. The two of these scholars is that Ron Howard and Howard Rafa has proposed alternative sort of frameworks for approaching structuring of the decision. One is called decision quality, and that's what is called West Coast school, and the East Coast school is PROACT, or it's an abbreviation also for decision process. I write a little bit more about it in the paper, and I very much recommend you to check out the references. But it's basically a structured way of checkboxing your decision-making process. You're saying, well, for decision, it's important that you state the problem. For decision, it's important that you explicitly state what are your alternative choices that you're making, what are the objectives that you're going to use for making that decision, and things like that. That checklisting is the two schools. They're overlapping, but there are some minor differences that are non-material to the discussion today. In environmental management, this approach is known as structured decision-making. There is a book published that is very highly regarded in environmental decision-making, what's called structured decision-making, but it is based on the same thought. And actually, Gregory has been a student of Keeney, and Keeney has been a student of Rafa. So it is like very easily traceable back to the same roots. Modeling approach to DA is a particular approach where the decision model is like external product that the team working on the decision is putting together. It's engineering in the sense that you produce something of a product development cycle, and every expert is contributing to, and decision makers also providing their value input and judgment input and things like that. So it's attempting to externalize the decision process into objective kind of incarnation of that decision problem, centered around modeling. And therefore, that extra personal representation should help achieve objectiveness and liberate people to kind of criticize decision problem without being personal about it, right? So that external representation is helping to let's say, improve reasoning in the decision. And the objective is not to provide single right answer. It's not that it's like a crystal ball that is going to spit out the, this is what you should do, but it rather enlightens or provides this clarity of action, some illuminates the problem in a particular way. A decision maker still has full liberty of using his or her own values and trade-offs the way they feel pleased, but really the external representation allows them to kind of gain independence and be certain that all aspects have been considered. So those things will be used in later of our discussions. I just want to also kind of diverge a little bit into yet another interesting topic, which is related to values in science. And this very cool article in Handbook of Philosophy, I think, right? Philosophy of Science, talks about value-free ideal, and Douglas 2015, and the value-free ideal proposed by Weber and Kuhn, which basically says that only epistemic values are allowed in science. You're not allowed to bring any non-epistemic values. By epistemic values, we mean anything that's related to science, knowledge acquisition, right? And the personal values that we have, they're not allowed in science, except for, and these are the things that they've listed, where you could, or let's say, it is inevitable that some non-epistemic values will be applied. And that is when you're choosing direction of research, researcher is at liberty of choosing the research topic that they feel passionate about, and therefore, well, some other values will, of course, influence. Another area is when you choose a method, there's also some, kind of personal judgment involved, and therefore non-epistemic values will be affecting that choice. And science is saying like, well, we can't really do anything about it. And the main focus in this article and generally in science is about the sufficiency of evidence and how, let's say, if you are, in trade-off of false positives and false negatives, and in COVID situation, that's very like a relevant discussion today. So what is more important, false positives or false negatives when we're testing patients? And that judgment is inherently value-based, right? What are you valuing more? And science says, well, yes, but you have to state what you can accept as sufficient evidence and things like that. So very vague kind of discussion about how to deal values affecting that decision and what is acceptable and how to transfer that value. And that's unfortunately kind of left in the air in that article. But I want to say that the pragmatist approach to it is say, well, why do you have to separate? Values are inseparable from science inquiry, and therefore they need to be embraced and examined. Just accept it. It is impossible that the non-epistemic value will not affect your research. It will affect your research. And multi-criteria decision analysis is systematically eliciting values, organizing it, and putting them into the models for combining with other inputs, which is, let's say, probabilistic judgments and some other things that are important for decision making, and ultimately aiming at ranking alternatives. So values here are just yet another input, and there's no, let's say, there's no judgment about epistemic or non-epistemic. All values are relevant. Let's go for it. The criticism of decision analysis is usually, well, it kind of assumes that decision maker is fully aware of his own judgments or her own judgments. And therefore, the non-Bayesian decision theory came along, which is saying, we'll walk the decision maker through the process of realizing what is it that they value. And in that process, discovery process, some values will appear, but you shouldn't assume that the decision maker has the values in their head. And that may be a relevant objection. Yes, I don't carry the value function in my head, crystal clear, but it is possible through, let's say, decision structuring, set up a problem in such a way that will clarify the decision for me, even though I don't have a very easily formulated decision function. So I'm saying, if you're not aiming the right answer, then it is not really critical that decision maker has a readily available value function. So you structure a problem and then say, well, go ahead and poke it around for decision maker and make your mind, what do you value more? In the process of testing the model, decision maker might discover his or her own value functions and trade-offs, and that way it will still be illuminating for decision. So the difficulty to trade off conflict in decisions is not the same as difficulty of just enumerating what alternative, well, objectives could exist. So in a sense, it is more difficult for me to say, do I value, let's say, scientific progress more, or do I value, let's say, conservation, some of the conservation issues more? What is more important to discover, particular process in the environment, or protect species in particular instance? That may be something that I will discover later on, but if you show me how these two are trading off, then I will make my mind which one I want to choose. I will position myself along that continuum, but it is obvious, and it shouldn't be too difficult to at least enlist those objectives. Say, I value diversity, but I also value scientific progress. So let's see if we can show the trade-off between them. All right. So my question to that's something that I don't have answer for, but maybe that will spark your interest as well. Can decision analysis objectify values or discussion about values in the same way that Bayesian analysis has objectified otherwise subjective probabilities? So before Bayesian analysis came along, people were skeptical at subjectivism, right? And their like early 20th century's criticism to Bayes theory has been, well, it's all in your head. You can't really trust those judgments. But it's shown systematically that you can objectively and, let's say, in disciplined way reason about probabilities, even though they remain subjective. Can the same be done for values by saying, yeah, let's elicit them. Let's see if we can show the trade-off between them. They will still remain personal, but at least we can objectively study them as an object. So coming back to models, because that's my main focus of the paper. Environmental systems, as I said, are very rich in uncertainties, various types of uncertainties. For waterfall management, these have been listed. Natural variations, so stochasticity in the systems, very difficult to penetrate. Limited observability, we're limited. Let's say we know about location of geese only as much as our monitoring programs allow that to know. And that is funding, of course, limited by funding. We can't really fund every possible monitoring program on Earth. There's limited controllability. Even when you publish a hunting regulation, it might not be enforced the way you intended to, or it might be enforced with unintended consequences. So that's limited controllability. And there is, of course, structural uncertainty that's related to just limited understanding of how the system works at all. And that is also irreducible, but really because of dynamic nature of the systems, it is difficult to hope that we will ultimately understand every process in nature. So the question then comes, so how much of the detail should be included in the model? We have so many uncertainties, should we incorporate everything? And there are two approaches that I could find. Both of them are focusing on reducing the scope for the model. So one of them is a reductionist approach that argues for, well, let's model only things that we can transfer between the domains and things that are universal phenomena, so that we can minimize number of parameters to be learned. And that approach is focusing on complexity of the model for the sake of reusing pieces of it in other domains, or maybe borrowing some other models from other domains. And that's a reasonable approach. The pragmatic approach of decision focused is we're only including things that are relevant for the decision. If it's not relevant for deciding right now, it should be out of the model. It doesn't matter if it describes or more iteration. So you have to first discover what is relevant for deciding. The first step is what is it that you're deciding, then discover what is relevant, and only then you can include it into the model. There's this chart that lays out statistical methods on the scale of availability of data and knowledge of the system. And basically, the more you know, the more precise methods you can use. And this is ordinary differential equations and let's say, individual agent-based models on limited data availability. On large data availability, you can go for machine learning and deep learning and whatnot. But it is basically it's a scale, it's a gradient along which you can apply different methods depending on where we land on these two parameters. All right, so talking a little bit about modeling of decision process itself. So modeling of the system has been my previous topic, and right now we're talking about how do we model decision-making process. It's primarily focused around Markov decision process, and it's a mathematical model for sequential decision-making in stochastic environments. The basic idea is that you take an agent, you place him into stochastic environment, and it changes, the environment changes in response to the actions. The state of the environment rewards the agent, but also determines how likely it is that the state will change. So both of these things are varying, and the objective is to select a sequence of actions that will maximize the reward. But there's an embedded trade-off. Do you want to receive utility now, or do you want to improve your chances of receiving utility later? Because it's a sequential process. It's not a one-time game, it's a long-term game. And therefore, this trade-off is embedded inside of the MDP. There are some variations with regards to uncertainty. You can have systems with fully known parameters, and that's what most textbooks will show to you. MDP with known parameters. There's still stochasticity, but it is parameters of the distributions of the variables that are affecting it are known, or MDP under uncertainty, and that's a more difficult case, of course. But more relevant for waterfall management is processes with limited observability, and for that, the POMDP have been designed, which is partially observable MDP process, and that's when you cannot really know what the state of the system is at every step, and you need to only gauge it from limited samples, let's say, about the current system state. So that's what is used for most policy evaluations in waterfall management. So waterfall management, as it is implemented today in the world, is based on adaptive management. Adaptive management is basically this do, learn, do cycle. When you do something, then you observe what happened, and then you can adjust your next action. The most important for active adaptive management is learning. The whole setup is around learning. How can we learn yet another thing? And all experiments are set up this way, and they're explicitly accounting for uncertainty, not even accounting, they're targeting uncertainty. And the main purpose is to design interventions that will reduce uncertainty. The adaptive management, the whole program is as good as your experimental design. If your experimental design is good, then of course the adaptive management program will be successful in this at least instance. And some complex references here. And that approach to adaptive management will employ multiple models. Each one will state some alternative hypothesis, and they will target maybe individual unknowns and try to resolve them one at a time, and finally converging into that single management model. So you discover something in an experiment, and then you put all these kind of learnings into a single model for, okay, now we need to implement some sort of action to manage the resource. It is able to learn very fast, but it is expensive. Of course, you can imagine that there's always a countless number of experiments that you could do, and therefore it can grow kind of expensive. Passive adaptive management is a setup in which learning is only a byproduct. The primary objective is still objective-based management, so you're managing resource, and as a byproduct, you're expecting to learn something. So, okay, so we're changing hunting regulation now, we're lowering the quota. We're going to expect some response. Let's set up in such a way that we're able to incorporate that learning into our models. So usually it means that you have multiple models, but primarily for management, it's using one most appropriate model or model averaging, while the model weights that go into that ensemble are updated through learning from previous iterations. So you can implement something, you have alternative hypothesis, let's say about mortality or mortality of waterfall, and you're updating both models, reweighting them into a single model, and based on that model will be implemented some actions. Learning is of course slower because the discovered information is not targeted precisely in the intervention, but it is crucial to have alternative models that are targeting varied hypotheses, really different hypotheses. Otherwise, the updating will not give you any information. So if let's say, if you're smart about designing your models in such a way that they're targeting really different hypotheses, then there will be some learning happening regardless, even though it's not designed to be learning that way. It is, of course, more economic on budget. There's also a passive aggressive, I call it steady state, which is let's do nothing, let's just wait and see, and that is status quo for many public decisions, unfortunately. Basically, when the surveys are done, and this literature review here is an example of that, it says that adaptive management is often misunderstood. Trial and error is not adaptive management, okay? And that's what paper is saying. Adaptive management, at least in the way it's been originally proposed by Holling in 1978, is proactive experimentation with a method of learning through experiments. So that definition is a little bit more than just trying if it works and then do something else. Of course, all decision making is learning always from previous mistakes, but is that systematic scientific approach to that learning and being aware of, let's say, experimental setup that will differentiate adaptive management from just a random wandering around. Okay, I'm going to switch or go further with adaptive management and talk a little bit about different schools of adaptive management. They are kind of mapping active and passive adaptive management closer than they want to admit. The resilience experimental school is primarily about active adaptive management. So it's experiment based. So it's focusing on designing complex environmental models, capturing every detail, and then designing interventions that will kind of resolve some uncertainties that go into that. It is, it's originating from a school of thought that has been doing experiments for a long time. The theoretic school of thought in adaptive management is focusing on defining a problem, clarifying objectives. It's less complex models. This is the one that's adopted in US for waterfall management, and that's the one that Europe is adopting as well. So it is passive adaptive management, and there is no shame in admitting that it is passive. It's meaning that it's less expensive and it is more kind of aware of limitation of knowledge acquisition. And I am very encouraged to discover a lot of papers that are actually saying that monitoring programs are unnecessary, that we shouldn't waste money on let's say, resolving some uncertainties that are not possible to resolve. That, let's say, humble approach to knowledge acquisition is what is coming out of decision theoretic school. So the VOI, the value information discussion, is a direct product from decision theoretic school of adaptive management. It is, so VOI in the simplest form is a difference between value with and without information. That difference originates from changing course of action. So let's say you don't know something, you don't know when let's say the bus will come, you prefer to stay home longer. But if you knew that the bus is running a little bit early, then you could leave earlier and therefore catch the bus or things like that. So that difference in action is called value of information, and it is central to adaptive management approach that US has adopted for waterfall management. Articles by Runge are very kind of vocal about it. And the gradual adaptation is kind of also carrying the dual control problem. So do you want to spend money? And that is very kind of unique to the decision theoretic school of thought. Do you want to spend money on monitoring, or do you want to spend money on managing actually your resource? And so that trade-off is very kind of upfront. And when you're designing monitoring program, you need to be aware that anytime you take money out of the budget, you're reducing the amount of money that you could use for managing resource and put it into knowledge acquisition that may not be used. So lots of text here, but I'm going to skip along. What has been tried until now? So there are some listing of the objectives that have been used in waterfall management. So I listed them with the pluses and minuses here, which is indicating what we want to have more of and what we want to have less of. And those are the things that I could find through a lot of references that are listed above. So we want to have stable and sustainable population size. We want more stability, and we want to have more of that population stability in the world. We want to reduce threat to public health and safety. So that risk, or the even probability of getting some contamination from water, wild geese, for example, or wild animals generally, is a negative value that we still want to minimize. There are some things, let's say, tundra degradation in breeding range. That's been listed as one of the objectives. So want to minimize degradation of the northern territories and want to have less of that, right? Conflict with agriculture. The conflict itself is bad. It's not about consequences. It's just that we don't want to have conflict. And that is also a reasonable objective to have. And let's say long-term aggregate harvest, that means that how many birds have hunters accumulated over years. Hunting season length is relevant. We want to have as long hunting seasons as possible so that we have flexibility of adjusting population. So frequency of change in regulation, that's another one that is interesting. We don't want the regulation that jumps every year. We want to have something that is stable and, let's say, possible to implement actually. If you're changing the quota every year, it is very often that you will find yourself overshooting or undershooting. So that, for example, traffic safety, other things. So these objectives, and they are spread around in different literature, and very difficult to see a whole list and one decision model that would, let's say, address all of them. And I think that would be very useful to even state, what is it that people could care about with regards to waterfowl management? And these things that I could find, but there are maybe some things that are left out. What has been tried? So first of all, the main response, and that's what most articles are talking about, is harvest. So how much to harvest, when to harvest, what, let's say, strata of age and gender population to harvest. So those things are very well discussed, but also the disturbances and deterrence. So that's scaring of birds, anything that's related to relocation of them, kind of weigh them off of the fields that we don't want them to be in and invite them to the fields that we do want them to be. So that's sacrificial feeding areas as well. Norway has tried compensation to farmers, and some things went not as intended. And there is, of course, an important discussion, both in regulation, but also on local levels, how to engage stakeholders, how to invite and, into dialogue hunters and farmers together, and maybe with a mediation of some governing bodies. So that those things have been tried, let's say. But again, as Fox and others would say, and Johan has been part of that study, is we don't really have a very good overview of which one of these methods work, what's the effectiveness of each one. Even for scaring, it is not obvious that, let's say, all scaring works, and some of the methods are less efficient than we believe them to be, and there's just lack of data and lack of experiments have been done before for some of these methods. In US, I said that in the middle of 20th century, US has implemented bird protection on flyway scale. That means that Canada and US have cooperated to design the corridors. Actually, there are 3 corridors for migrating birds. And today they have very well set up monitoring programs, both the ringing and also like monitorings on the wintering sites. Just very holistic approach to managing the resources. So very well done. And Europe has followed along. In 1999, African Eurasian Water Bird Agreement has been signed by now 80 countries, but started with very few countries. But today they're following in the footsteps of US waterfowl. And actually, one of the researchers from US Geological Survey, who has been key to the US regulation, he is now advising the IAVA project and European Goose Management Group, which is EGM. That's what it stands for. So in waterfowl management, your decisions are focused around 3 areas: harvest, habitats, and human dimensions. And that's how my paper is structured as well, is that the models that are applied in each of these decision areas that are addressed separately. And I have only a few slides or 2 slides are finishing up. So harvest is about this annual cycle of, identifying regulatory action based on the knowledge that we know about the system, where the system is and what the dynamics is, weighting maybe these alternative models that I was talking about. Then given the optimal action, determine the model-specific projections of population size before the data is collected. So each of your alternative models that are designed to target particular hypotheses have their own projection before the data comes in. Then data comes in, you compare it to the projections that each model has made based on that, using Bayesian approach, you update the weights of the model, and then you prepare for next year. So that cycle is continuing for harvest, and this way you can update, I would say, alternative understanding of the system dynamics and the structural uncertainties that are in your models. More discussions is in the paper for these alternative models and hypotheses with mortality, for example, additive or compensatory, and there are some other, let's say, unresolved hypotheses that are targeted in the harvest domain. But that's the cycle, and you're watching for these variables that are observable from the annual cycle of harvest. For habitats, the focus is primarily on spatial allocation of birds. So anything that's related to, allocation, so species distribution, and anything that's related to movement, migration corridors, everything that is dealing with space is addressed in that domain. In the past, these problems have been modeled with differential equations, but lately ABM has come along, that's agent-based models, and there are many of them that are specifically today developed for waterfall management. There are some 4 of them listed here. Almas is the one that I intend to dive deeper, and that's developed by our Danish colleagues. And that model is used for IAVA project, supporting decisions in IAVA project. And it's animal landscape and man simulation model, and that's exactly what I'm kind of interested in, because it incorporates these kind of population dynamics, landscape layout, and the decisions that are imposed by human systems. So that's habitats, primarily ABMs. And in human dimension, you have this kind of complication in waterfalls. I said in the very first slide that you have multiple agents, so multiple objectives, multiple agents, plus you have pretty complex kind of spatial distribution and population dynamics. So it requires integrated approach to modeling individual decision-making behavior of individual actors within the system as it varies between animals and, let's say, human actors. So again, the question that I have to myself, should scientific models aim to explicitly account for differences in objectives as they affect agents' behavior within the model? It's pretty crucial that we account what farmers could do in response to, let's say, each other's actions, and what geese would do if they would get accustomed to scaring, and like every one of them will have some particular objectives that will govern their behavior within the model. So talking a little bit about conclusions, environmental decisions require structural approach because of complexities and many actors involved. Decision analysis is offering this prescriptive, pretty systematic approach to improving decision process. So it offers principles and processes and methods for embracing uncertainty and explicitly accounting for objectives and designing decision alternatives that are improving decision quality. And the particular implementation that we've been implemented in the US and in Europe is MCDA-based adaptive management, passive adaptive management, and model-based decision analysis is externalizing the decision problem, making it an object that all the parties, including experts, can contribute to enlighten, illuminate decision problem, provide clarity of action for decision makers. That's been the topic of my studies. Thank you. There are also 10 pages of references, but hopefully there are more. I mean, I'm very happy to follow up, and if you want to, if you're wondering about some topics, also have a look at the paper. There are many more interesting discussions that are included there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dmytro. Tell us if there is a weird sound coming in, because I have my microphone on as well. I forgot to welcome also Kristina Ekström, who is the institutional representative, also known as the examinator. I will open up for you, Kristina, to ask some questions, and then we could sort of all ask the questions that are burning on our lips. So just to sort of make sure that the people that are in the Zoom meeting can hear you, this is the microphone that we're going to use. By the way, I have several around here. So we can just make a test whether they hear you or not.
I talk now. Can you hear me? Can someone write yes?
So those of you who are in the Zoom meeting, could you give a thumbs up if they're okay?
Because I'm talking and talking and talking, and I wonder if you hear me.
Yeah. No one is responding from the Zoom meeting. Yes, they hear you.
They
Okay.
hear me. Perfect.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and interesting talk about this topic. That I'm sure we all see that this is very complex and not so easy to grasp. And I think it was nice to see this in the beginning, this holistic view that you gave on the environmental decision, that this is really not an easy area because it's so much complexity. You know what I mean. I was wondering if we go to slide 11, for instance. Yeah. You gave us there some example of for COVID-19.
Yeah.
Could you take this and transfer it to waterfowl management? How would it look?
Yeah.
Give us an example.
Yeah, good question. Very good. Right. So, I mean, anytime you have monitoring of anything, so COVID testing is monitoring, you will have false positives and false negatives. So, let's say your decision policy, and this is what actually has been done in Europe, they said that we want non-declining population, right? So that's one of the objectives that they say. We don't want population to decline. And let's say through some monitoring in some area, you discover that the population has been declining. There's a chance that that is false positive, and actual population is not actually declining, right? So you're directly in this situation. Do we want to increase monitoring effort? Do we want to retake the survey again, census again, because we want to make sure that that conclusion is really true, or do we want to say, okay, we're not going to change regulation, even if it is declining in 1 year, we'll wait and see for another year, and after 2 or 3 years in a row, then we will change regulation. This trade-off is based on how deeply do you care about that policy of non-declining population? Is that carved in stone, or is it just a guidance? And I think the European policy has made it very clear that these situations will appear, and therefore, even though let's say they have a target population of 60,000 and we want non-declining population, but that population is actually stated with a band around, so that if it varies by 10,000 plus or minus, we're willing to take it. It's a tolerable, let's say, variation. And in that sense, that the width of the range is already reflecting on the values by saying that we value stable policy slightly more than the 60,000 strict. You know what I mean? So there's a trade-off. By varying the width of the target, you're already expressing the trade-off between stability of the policy and preserving a non-defined population. So this is where the judgment trade-off comes in. And some decision makers might be, let's say, very much on compliance side. They say, well, I don't care about, we're super happy to ban next year's hunting because there are some signals that the population has been declining. So they will, no problem, of course, they will ban hunting, no big deal. And that would express particular trade-off. So this sufficiency of evidence is how much of the monitoring do you feel is sufficient to, let's say, accept false positives or false negatives. In any monitoring, you will have that judgment. And usually in scientific papers, they're not really discussing that very explicitly. So how did you decide that that is sufficient evidence? There are some, of course, p-values and things like that, but it is not really clear what values have influenced that judgment. So yeah, that was my answer.
Yeah, and if you would go to slide 14.
Yeah, very good. That's where I am.
Yes. No, it was not that one I
Not
was
that one?
thinking about. Was it?
This?
No, take
There's
the.
one after this.
I
16.
wrote slide 14. What did I mean? I don't know. But if you take this with do and so.
Doing so, yeah.
Yeah. And transfer that to waterfowl management, perhaps. That is.
Yeah. So I addressed. So I talked about harvest regulation, for example, and that is recurring decision making as well. A situation where you implement some, let's say, quota for next year, and then you monitor how that affects the population, and then you design your, intervention next year, which is changing harvest quotas or maintaining them on, let's say, changing the location where the birds can be shot. So that's a setup of do, learn, do, or adaptive management. The difference between active and passive adaptive management would be, for example, yes. So for example, you could set up a policy in which, sorry about talking about hunting, that's the most scientific literature would, take hunting as an example of these things. So I'm going to take it as well. So let's say you could set up a system, a policy for next year in which you are targeting only juveniles because you have a hypothesis in mind. So I'm talking about active adaptive management. You have a hypothesis in mind that shooting of juveniles is affecting reproducibility, reproduction rate, and therefore it will have some consequences for dynamics of the system. But let's say hunting of juveniles have nothing to do really, or very little to do with actual, policy implementation. So it's a very local question that you have in mind, how juveniles, hunting of particular age of birds is affecting reproduction rate. That would be active adaptive management. Example of intervention for active adaptive management. You have a particular scientific question in mind, how the dynamics of the, let's say reproduction will change depending on the age of the birds. So you design an experiment to intervene exactly at that uncertainty, or targeting this one particular uncertainty. The passive adaptive management would not make that distinction. It would say, well, we're going to lower the quota overall, but we will be prepared that when you hunt, let's say in Norway, you will affect more juveniles than when you hunt in Denmark, and therefore maybe we'll make some adjustment. But it is not targeted at learning those, pieces of information particularly. It is just it's adjusting to, let's say, preserve a stable population, less hoping to resolve the question about juvenile effect on reproduction rate. So difference between passive and active is that passive has a general question in mind, and active has a particular question in mind with regards to uncertainties. And the interventions are designed either generically for population and with objective, or let's say stability, these objectives that I said, right? So it's almost like, that may be my speculation, but if I would be allowed to state that hypothesis, maybe it is closer to epistemic and non-epistemic values. So do you value scientific kind of inquiry above the general values? The active adaptive management would be after scientific knowledge. It would, let's say, we have one variable that is affecting our setup in the model, and we don't know how it affects, so we want to learn more about it. Whereas passive adaptive management would say, well, our mandate is to keep the population stable, so we'll design a policy that targets that. And maybe we'll learn something about juveniles, maybe not, but okay, if we don't, sorry about that, maybe next year. So they're less concerned about individual variables in the model. They're more concerned of preserving these mandates and overall objectives for the management. So that would be my example of difference between interventions if you adopt one mindset versus the other.
I have a final thing I'd like to discuss a bit, and that is, how do you think today that decision makers make use of these models or theories? Are they aware of them? Do they use them? Or how is it? Is it like, I mean, if you look at different levels, Länsstyrelsen, or you look at the kommunfullmäktige here, or do they think in these terms of the models and really think what kind of approach should we use for this specific question if it comes to the environmental decision?
Right. Good question. And while I want to be optimistic and say that they do, but most of the time, the traditional decision making, look, we're humans, right? And we're super confident that we know how to make decisions. Of course, I make decisions every day. Do you think that I would be commune leader because I couldn't make decisions? Of course, this is what got me here. Yeah, I can do it. There's no problem. And so they will shoot from the hip. And it's everywhere. It's not only in public domain, it's also in industries, everywhere. And we're, very often, so let's say luck is confused with competence. And in complexity domains like this, it's also very difficult to define success. So last year we banned hunting in our community. Was it a success? I mean, how do we even judge that we actually approached closer to a target? So these questions are very difficult, and let's say lack of systematic approach to decision making is not presenting itself very easily. And so that's what is the Iowa project is trying to change. They're saying, well, certain things that you are not allowed to decide. We will put a working group, and this, let's say, a European goose management group is saying, well, we'll have an international species management plan that is going to look at the whole flyway and design the interventions that are relevant for the population beyond the scope of your little community. And then within that, of course, and all of those decisions will be driven by models. Within that, we'll, of course, give you some liberty of deciding how you want to implement it. But the bigger decisions are requiring higher scope view, and these international bodies are now realizing that you need to lift the decision maker from the local scope to a flyway scope, because that's where the problem is set up. It's along the flyway that the regulation should be happening. It's not within the scope of the community. So that realization of appropriate scope for every decision is, I think, very often lacking. And we discussed it. We had one student that worked on coastal management. So that's a coastal defense against the coast erosion. And that's also, I mean, it might look like a particular individual communist problem. Our dunes are being washed away, but it is actually a country or maybe even a continent problem, that if you elevate the decision-making to that level, you have a decision-maker body that you can artificially maybe assemble from all countries that are facing that problem, maybe it might have a better grip on the problem, because it is affecting. And so one community is building, let's say, a wall, and that will erode the coast 5 miles down the road because of unintended consequences. Global problems require global decision making, and that decision maker has not existed until now. And the projects like I have a project is putting this artificially putting decision maker together by designing these committees that are able to look at that bird eye view on the whole scope of the problem. So I think it is happening, and the more we can kind of the more science can speak up in this, the better it will be. So waterfowl management is not a single example. It is easily transferable to coastal management, to any other areas that are requiring this global view that are today's managed on local scope. And also, almost if you're in the community position, it almost is irrelevant what kind of model you put together, because that model is limited in scope anyways. It will be very limited in data collection, in overview. You're not going to account for repercussions of your decisions. So yes, it's not there yet, but we're moving.
Do you have any further questions? For an hour more, but I think I'm happy there. And I think it's a very interesting and an important topic that we all need to learn more about.
Okay.
I hope that approach is transferable to other domains as well.
So I thank you, Gisela. And then we open up for questions from the audience. And I would like to encourage those that are on Zoom to sort of make yourself known and say something. You can sort of make a message in the chat window if you want to ask a question. And I open up. Is there anyone who has anything you would like to ask Dmytro about now? Yeah, Jörgen, you say hi about
Please type your question in Zoom, please.
Yeah. So you can type your question soon, but Jörgen is actually here physically. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so I'm interested in this adaptive management that you talked about quite a bit already, but inherently in that there is this trade-off between acquiring new information versus actually doing the management. You're supposed to do at the same time somehow.
Yeah.
But you have to choose how much you value one or the other. And I guess this value of information concept is a guideline.
Right.
Which takes into account perhaps future benefits of getting information right now.
Right.
But certainly there must be lots of uncertainties and values go into that, how you design or calculate your value information.
Absolutely, yes.
So is there any way of doing this without being very biased in one way or another, or putting your values within the decision process?
Right. So and this is like you're right on, spot on the question that is often misunderstood about value information. So people somehow believe that value information is a mathematical expression. You just throw it onto the model and it's going to spit out the answer. That's not true. Value information is very conditioned on the values that you consider. It's a value function specific value, but it is also conditioned on alternatives. So let's put it this way. So I'm back to my bus example, right? You're trying to get to the school on time. And the way you state values matters. Do you want to get to school on time? Do you want to avoid being caught by principal? The way you state even the objective is going to affect what the value information is. But okay, let's say that we want to get on school on time, right? And then your alternatives are bike or walk, right? And value information in that sense is, you can design value, you can calculate value information between those two alternatives. What if I would know that it would rain? Should I bike or not? Should I walk? Things like that. But if you introduce one more alternative, which is take a bus, or yet another alternative, I could ride a car, in a sense, like call taxi and give me a lift directly to the door of the university. That's a whole different value information question. Because as soon as you add one more alternative, the preferences between the alternatives and ranking of the alternatives will change immediately. So value information is particularly conditioned on the set of choices that you have and what values do you have? What do you care? Do you care to be on time? Do you care to catch a lecture? Do you care to be more with your family? What trade-offs do you actually face? And all of these things are, so whenever value information is discussed, all of this needs to be stated. We value these three things, these four alternatives we considered, this is the value information. You know what I mean? So it's impossible to separate them. You don't, so objectiveness is in explicit statement. It's almost like you're talking about your scientific models. You're required to state your parameters, right? This is almost the same thing. You state, well, parameters of this value information is these three objectives and those four alternatives. They are parameters to my value information calculation. And therefore, you don't like it, change the value setup, you'll get new number. But this is very crucial and maybe new to scientific reporting because we don't feel comfortable listing values, but it is impossible to get to value information without listing those objectives. And metrics, how you measure, right? So how do you measure dissatisfaction of the principal of your school? Is that, so how do you even measure? So those measurements are very critical, otherwise you wouldn't know. It's not monetary. Value information is not monetary. It's not necessarily monetary. It can be made monetary, but it's not necessarily so.
Oops. I asked you to unmute because I don't know how
I did. I didn't. Oh,
yeah, I just asked you to unmute because I'm going to ask a question.
Yes, go.
And yeah, so my question is, so my impression is that we have been thinking that we make the science and then we deliver a product to the decision makers and then they can make good decisions.
Yeah.
But what you have basically convinced us in the beginning of your talk is that no, we have to include the decision process in when we are doing the science,
yes.
And we have to acknowledge the the sort of dimensions of decision analysis to sort of target more focused science on where it makes where it has most effect or impact on helping actually decision makers make the
what it will be used for.
Yeah, and so one of those things is the embracement or acknowledgement of values in science, and so I really sort of think that you're on to something here, and you have been it's been very interesting to see how you can actually clarify these things, because it's something that it's not easy to grasp this area and actually explain this is what it means to include decision making in science, and not see it as something that is going to use scientific outputs.
Yeah.
So one of those things that you mentioned is this use of ontological uncertainties.
Yeah.
And I feel still a bit uncertain about what they actually mean. I'm not telling you to explain them fully here, but Mike, is it that it could be that we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and if we sort of do a scientific advice now based on our understanding of decision problem, it could change in the future. And by considering ontological uncertainties, would that mean that you would consider how it could also look like in the future decision problem? Or is it just that you acknowledge that it may change? That's my question.
Yeah. Let me, so the humble way of answering the question, I'm unmuted, I think.
Yeah,
Humble way of answering the question is I don't know, because none of the things that I discussed today are relevant in ontological uncertainty. Ontological uncertainty means that your models and objectives and alternatives are all irrelevant. So what you have, so you set up a perfect decision model, right? You have listed your objectives. We value diversity, biodiversity. We value whatever that amount of meat that hunters bring home, and things like that. And then we set up alternatives, which is scaring birds or shooting them, for example. And we set up what else? We set up models to model it. Ontological uncertainty says that all of it will change, right? So none of your setup, your decision setup, is irrelevant for the future. So how do you, set up? How do you prepare yourself to act in that respect? So what the ontological uncertainty literature talks about, they're talking about nobody could expect, let's say, today's effect of social media on society, or disinformation campaigns and the post-truth kind of world that we have today. That was not even anticipated. At the time when we designed the internet, we didn't anticipate how drastically would our choices set up change, how values would change as a result. So if we were talking about uncertainties related to internet back before pre-internet era, we could not be even considering those dimensions of the decision problem, you know what I mean? And even less be prepared to talk about it. But only through science fiction kind of extrapolating speculation, only that way you can get into dystopian future and say, well, what would we do today to prepare ourselves for that? And that's what scenarios that they're talking about, the non-probabilistic scenario-based methods that they're talking about. They are science fiction stories, and then backcasting from it, saying, okay, let's say that the world in 2065 will be this book. How do we prepare today for that future? And so those are the methods. But none of the things that I discussed today are relevant. This is all kind of obsolete by definition. And I just listed it in the sense that epistemic uncertainty can get to those extreme examples where your setup today, the way you think is irrelevant. And that's what they're talking about. But I'm not prepared to even start talking.
Okay. I will force you to do it. I have an idea. Anyway, we have two questions from people via Zoom. Let's try, if you put on your speaker, let's try that you, Maria, if you start, if you could ask your question by unmuting and posing it live.
Let's see if I can.
Maria.
Yeah, Maria.
Hi, thank you, Dmytro, for your presentation. It was very clear and nice. And I was wondering, linking into the discussion on VOIs, how they potentially also could be linked to people's perceived relevance of these parameters. But from a psychological perspective, this relevance would really decide how much weight each of those would have in people's decisions, as I understand it. Did you understand my question?
Mute myself. So the value information will determine how relevant a particular uncertainty is to a decision maker. So let's say general public is concerned about something, and so systematically thinking about that uncertainty in terms of how valuable it is to know will determine how relevant it is. Yes. So I have a scientific hypothesis here, which is that our intuition will fail us at determining relevance by, strictly speaking, a value information kind of theoretic approach. So if you let me try to put it this way. If I were to elicit your values about a particular subject, so let's talk about something that is urgent today, nuclear power something, right? A very urgent issue for many people. So if I would elicit your values about it, so what do you value? Safety and availability of energy and cost of milk and everything, right? And put it into the model. And I would elicit actually from experts, I would elicit risks and run it by you so that you would accept that, yes, those risks seem to be reasonable, and put everything systematically into the model and calculate value information of knowing, let's say, reliability of the nuclear reactor. So that's a potential threat. The nuclear reactor will, Chernobyl will happen again, things like that. You will be surprised that the way you feel that information is relevant and the way math will tell you how relevant that information is, there will be a disparity between those two. And more often, our intuition will tell us things are more relevant than we logically would arrive at as relevance. You know what I mean? So it can enlighten, but I'm not surprised that our today's concern and relevance, perception of relevance, is very colored with emotions and logical kind of cold reasoning, the way Bayesian analysis does for probabilities, would let's say illuminate some of those decisions, and it should. In many scientific discussions, it should, because we should talk about, let's say, nuclear reactor risk in terms of values. So what do you value? Pollution, safety, availability of energy, cost of milk. Let's put it all together. If you value them in these proportions, this is the value information of knowing the reliability of this equipment and things like that. And that would be very constructive and helpful for the public discourse around the things that are today considered relevant. Is that answering any? I don't have a very precise answer, but this is like my hunch is the way our intuition fails us about probabilities, it does also fail us about values. That's my, at least, hypothesis here. And
yeah, no, good. I just wanted to challenge you in starting thinking in these terms and how we could sort of potentially link sort of more psychological knowledge related to the decision-making structures, and also link it to the discussions on how these models will be relevant in public decision-making, for example, in terms of the geese management.
Good question, and thank you for tipping me onto this topic. And we could as well, I mean, thank you. I just want to state Marie is my advisor. So we could spin our paper that we'll be writing about geese management and, let's say, the decision making around that, in that aspect of, let's address the value information and perception, the environmental psychology aspect of it. Thank you. Accepted. Challenge accepted.
Okay. Yeah. We have a question from Jessica. Could you ask it, yes, Jessica?
Yes, sure. I just wanted thank you so much, Dmytro, for your very nice presentation. I was wondering, like, how do you think the process of participatory public decision making will affect the main core of a decision making that needs to be done, let's say, in environmental research management? Sometimes the public has, well, we tend to say now in sustainable development agenda that the public has to take part of the decision process, but this is taking a whole different level in how you consider the boundaries of the systems. So I wanted to know from your perspective, maybe broad or very brief, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I'm afraid of misrepresenting the question, but let me take a liberty, and Jessica, you will correct me if I said something wrong. So what you're asking is, given that the way we define the boundaries of the decision problem in environmental in waterfall management, how does public decision making fit in, and participation of public in particular? Yeah, and so how does that affect even a setup of the decision making?
What is your
Correct.
Yeah, what is my view? Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficult question, but let's yeah.
You could answer it just only saying by, well, it could be negative or only positive. And
Oh no, that would be too simple. And I don't think that it is that easy to say negative or positive.
I know. I
But
didn't want to put it so abstract. Sorry.
Yeah. So particular, it's a very good question. But particular strata of public, let's say hunters or farmers, their objectives are very clear. Like you can at least talk to them in terms of the objectives that they have. The general public has a perception, of course, and they have a say. And let's say one of the papers here, I don't know if it's listed, not on this slide, but on some other slides, there are listed papers that are discussing urban geese. So you have geese that are wandering around in parks, right? And authorities recognizing public health threat, they're trying to get the geese out of the park because they can, they can make it messy, let's put it this way. And public is objecting. There's a case in US where public has revolted after the geese has been expelled from the park because they like the view. They enjoy the birds wandering around and floating around, and ducks are so beautiful, and we like to feed them, right? That's a whole different set of values. Yes, it makes it more difficult to make decisions in light of the public opinions, but recognizing, okay, there's a static value of waterfowl or water birds in the parks. Let's account for it. Let's take it into consideration. And explicitly, when we make models, we'll basically, we'll calculate implications of our decisions on this objective. So if we relocate, we shoot all the birds from the park, that will drive this value metric to 0. So the tourist attractiveness of our park will plummet immediately. Okay, fine. But we will get a full health benefit. So there will be no risk of contamination or public diseases or anything like that. And public will need to be educated about it. So there is no passive way of getting around public participation without education. You need to explain it to the public by saying, well, we are making this policy. Okay, we understand that there's a beauty value in the ducks in the park. Okay, there's also this much of a risk, and science says this is a probability of getting disease from the, whatever bird flu from these birds. In light of this trade-off, this is what we're going to do. So don't just accept the public opinion as, well, public doesn't like us to, whatever, shoot the birds, but more of like, engage in dialogue with them, and don't, just so anticipating what sort of concerns might public have and accounting for it in the model might inform the discussion. You know what I mean? It is easy to say public doesn't like it, but why don't they like it? So let's go and elicit their values, put it into our model, run through the model, and communicate back the trade-offs, saying, do you want to get 5% more the probability of sickness, or do you want beauty of the 15 more ducks in the pond? Which one do you choose? And that's a much more constructive discussion. And that discussion is not happening today, I think, in many instances. We're just saying, well, public will dislike it. We don't do anything about educating. We don't communicate science in relevant terms to them. No wonder they don't like it. Do you see what I mean? So I just wanted to raise the bar for, yes, the public is a difficult decision maker, but what do we do to even communicate to that decision maker? Is the science today addressed to talk about trade-offs with the public values? And that is what I'm trying to change with my, at least, research here, is to say, well, it kind of puts a higher requirement onto the scientific output.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, we could discuss further. Thank you.
I'm super happy, please.
Yeah, and now there is an echo because I have unmuted my microphone or muted it, whatever it's called. So I'm just going to wrap up now because I feel that you have to turn off your.
I'm turning off.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Dmytro, and thank you, the audience, for attending. And I don't know if there is anything I need to say at this point, but the paper is, you will share the paper with the other PhD students so they can read it if they want to. And I look forward to see the outcome of your research. And then please, if you think this was interesting, contact us, and then we can continue to discuss it at some other point.
Yeah.
So thank you, and now I will close the Zoom meeting.
Thank you so much.